Little mortal flesh keep silence, and with fear and trembling stand. Wonder nothing earthly minded, for with blessing in his hand, Christ our God to earth descended, our full homage to devote. King of kings, yet born of Mary, as honored on earth he stood. Lord of lords in human vesture, in the body and the blood, he will give to all the faithful his own filling for heavenly food. Rank on rank the host of heaven spreads its vanguard on the way, as the light of light descendeth from the realms of endless day, that the powers of hell may vanish as the darkness clears away. At his feet the saints with seraphs, cherubim with sleepless stars, fill their faces to the presence, as with ceaseless voice they cry, Alleluia, 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 Lord Most High. Thomas Merton has a book entitled Bread in the Desert, and it is based on this giving of a supernatural food to those on the way home in the desert of solitude, but also in the desert of life. The manna was something which we're not quite sure of its nature, but certainly it was a way of existing when there was nothing else there. It caused great puzzlement to the Hebrews themselves. Manhu, what is that? And the prefiguring of the bread of angels, which is what we have the fullness of here at the altar, is quite evident. We also notice that many things happened in the desert which are a lesson unto us, and which the monks in particularly picked up. The advantage of simplicity, uncomplicated emptiness, was very soon picked up. The desert had been initially a place of refuge against persecution, but then when the red martyrdom of true suffering and torture for Christ was no longer possible after the Edict of Milan, then the white martyrdom of a virtual martyrdom, death to the senses and death above all to the will under obedience, was perceived in all its glory, and that became, of course, the beginning of what we're at right through the centuries, shedding things. Indeed, that reverts to the gospel that we have just heard, that element of not being throttled, because when there is no protection against the material and the world, one is drawn to the material and the world, and one survives amidst those thorns, and in practice it is difficult to be free, interiorly free, whereas the simplicity of the desert does draw attention to the invisible. When in college, in university, I remember that the Catholic Society used to organize a pilgrimage to Cordy Island every year. We're going back to the early 70s or mid-70s, and the first encounter with that monastic island, which goes back to the Celtic period, was very moving. And so I asked if I could spend the Christmas, or rather it was the Easter vacation with them in community, and so the two of us actually from the seminary I was staying in went for that period. and it was very interesting because one found there the simplicity of the desert in the Celtic mode. They used to do it through islands and mountains, the equivalent of the sand and sun in the western fringe, here the Celtic fringe of civilization, where nature has its own way of talking about the beyond. But, and it was a big but, when it came to Sunday afternoon, I could not but notice that all that effort to create a desert with that separation from the world by water and silence with a very strict regime seemed to be actually inquinated, poisoned and even subverted right from within by one gadget which was holding forth in the heart of the cloister. It was a colour television, and in those days it wasn't yet really the thing to be videoing things. That was something which was coming in bit by bit, therefore it was only what was available on the air at the time that could be seen, and of course it was football and things of that nature, and I thought to myself, what's going on? And a young man actually does, strangely enough, see things quite clearly because he's not got any influence from within, he's free. And this element of incoherence was a bit troubling, hence the reaction to go to France, where things were perhaps a bit more radical on certain issues. But it's something which needs to be looked at, because that is just an example of what by now has destroyed not only monastic life, but various forms of religious life throughout the world. You have many people who are actually consecrated to prayer, who are using those free moments for which they're there to do what? Now one asks oneself, is it worth it? Leaving the world to find more of the same. And all this element of creating a structure where one has not less but more in the realm of complication, because that actually happens when one takes on board a community and a convent, one has a lot of extra responsibility. Is it actually worth it? And one notices too, quite often, that when things aren't exactly as perhaps God would have them be, what happens? Well, because we're handling a divine issue, the divine does not necessarily follow. And quite often, convents and monasteries which do get involved with a certain compromise find that the Lord is not actually free to bless, and they eventually get into trouble. Just actually the other day I was picking up information about the French monastic world, and it is interesting to notice there that there are right now to be seen certain patterns emerging. Those monasteries which are either very traditional, and for a certain type of people that actually draws because they come from a certain type of family, e.g. Latin and Tridentine rite, do still attract, but there's also another who are into a more renewed form of prayer, who do attract, and it is precisely those that have remained in the line of fidelity to their origin. And right now, out of all the monasteries of the renewal in France, I'm talking about the Cistercians of the Reform, Trappists, it is interesting, and I heard that already a few years ago when I was in France, the one that actually right now is obviously drawing big-time vocations is actually the one that is most austere and most faithful. It gets a name for itself. It's Sept fountains, and site 7, that was Sept. And it's actually there that all the vocations tend to drift, because precisely they find something that it's worth drifting towards for. It's not any really interesting challenge to find something which is actually going only halfway when they want actually to give all. And I remember hearing that in France, that if one wants vocations, one has to be strict. Because the abbot of La Trappe used to say years ago, plus on est strict, plus on a des vocations. The stricter one is, the more one gets vocations. So not always the case, but there's something to be said for it, because a young man or a young woman actually wants something which is a challenge, and they're not going to settle very easily for more of the same thing. All this as a backdrop to the feast that we're celebrating today. Sharbel McCloof, who started in the monastery, the cenobium, and was ordained eventually there, but after a good few years obtained permission to become a hermit under the obedience of the superior, but right up on the mountain, and under very severe conditions, with only one consolation, the Blessed Sacrament, with which he had a great devotion, with which he spent hours and hours of adoration and prayer, because although he was of the Eastern Rite, the spirituality of the West was very much obviously a part of it. The Maronites are halfway between, but he did have consolation of the Blessed Sacrament, and we know that he was much sought after, which also happens at people, and a monastery which is faithful then attract also. But he was very severe, and he would not actually want people to be taking pictures. So there was no picture while he was alive, but when he died, eventually some pilgrims came and took a picture of the tomb and of the group of pilgrims, and the Lord obliged them by putting a picture of the dead saint on the negative. So we have a true picture of him after his death. And we also have his presence, even actually in this chapel, in a sense, among us in a strange form. It's what oozes out of his body still, immediately after his death, and to this day it's the same. This miraculous oil comes out and does miracles. It's actually here. And we know that in the East, oil is something of great significance. Often miracles do happen in the connection of oil, or the Lord allows oil to come out of even icons and various things, so that the Lord is using what is in their parlance, the norm, to get through to them. They are very much involved with the material. In their cult, it's a very incarnate cult, hence the use of incense, lights, icons, touching things, kissing things, moving around. It's very much something which suggests using the material, what is immaterial. And that too is something that we need to bear in mind on this feast of somebody who was the best of both worlds in that case, that the East is something that we need to respect. Because precisely, as we have seen in the Gospel here, this notion of the going apart like Moses to that holy mount comes into it. They come into a great cloud of glory, something similar to what happened on Mount Sinai when they come close to the presence of God. The house is full of smoke, and that suggests the Shekinah, which means the dwelling place of God. And they come with fear and trembling into something greater and beyond themselves, something which we need to retrieve. When one goes into an Eastern church, an Eastern Orthodox celebration, one is very much aware of the divine majesty, and man just disappears. And I remember hearing recently actually from somebody who had lots to do with the Eastern Rite, was saying that they're very humble. As you're saying in Italian, umili, they are very humble. The whole attitude of a person in the Eastern Rite before God is disappearance. And that's why there's great possibility for God to act in that soul, because he finds a tranquility of mode. The instincts, the mind are tranquilized over a long period of reception, and that is important. We come into church and we find the same kind of desecration as I mentioned in the monastic world. In some cases we find more of the human, and God is not free to bless. Churches which draw in the long run are churches which have something to offer. Prayer groups that are flourishing are prayer groups that are truly Christ-centered and truly authentic. God is not free to bless more of the same thing, ourselves. So with that in mind, we ask Saint Sharbel to help us to find, through his intercession, that element of interiority, verticality, and holy fear which characterized the best of what he had, and which is ours by right as well. For we only have one Father, and we are all brethren in him.